I'm Laura London, and this is a special holiday edition of Speaking of Jung. Joining us today for episode 130 is Jungian analyst Dr. Joseph Cambray in Carpinteria, California. He began in science, studying quantum mechanics applied to chemical systems, earning a Ph.D. in chemistry from the University of California Berkeley, followed by 2 years as a postdoctoral fellow at Stanford. He then spent several years as a visiting professor of chemistry at Osaka University in Japan, where he began practicing Zen meditation. An influx of important and relevant dreams prompted him to begin exploring the field of psychology, leading him to Dallas, Texas, where he studied with James Hillman. After earning a master's degree at East Texas State University, he began working as a psychotherapist and training as a Jungian analyst at the C.G. Jung Institute of Boston, where he earned a diploma in analytical psychology in 1991. Dr. Cambray has worked on the faculty of Harvard Medical School's Center for Psychoanalytic Studies at Mass General Hospital's Department of Psychiatry and taught in the Jungian and Archetypal Psychology specialization at Pacifica Graduate Institute. He continues to teach, is an external examiner of Ph.D. dissertations at the University of Essex in England, and is the liaison for the International Association for Analytical Psychology's developing group in Beijing, China. He has served as president of the Jung Institute of Boston and the IAAP, as provost and vice president of academic affairs and later CEO president of Pacifica, and spent 8 years as U.S. editor for the Journal of Analytical Psychology, of which he currently sits on their editorial advisory board. Dr. Cambray's many publications include the book based on his Fay lectures, Synchronicity, Nature and Psyche in an Interconnected Universe, Volume 1 of Research in Analytical Psychology, Applications from Scientific, Historical, and Cross-Cultural Research, and along with his wife, fellow Jungian analyst, and our November guest, Linda Carter, Analytical Psychology, Contemporary Perspectives in Jungian Psychology. He has also contributed to volumes 3 and 5 of Jung's Red Book for Our Time, as well as the Festschrift for Murray Stein, published earlier this year. His latest research, 21st Century Unconscious, Altered States, Oracles, and Intelligences, was recently published in the book Depth Psychology and Climate Change, edited by Jungian analyst Dr. Dale Mathers. Next year, Dr. Cambray will join Speaking of Jung guests Linda Carter and Marion Dunley at the annual Jung in Ireland seminar, Dreams, Divination, and Synchronicity, Pathways to Healing, from April 12th through the 19th in County Galway. He will be presenting Divination and Oracles, When the Self Speaks, Do We Listen? Manifestation of the Numinous, and Listening to the Soul, Altered States of Consciousness and Synchronicity. Today's episode is made possible by Temenos Dream, the revolutionary new dream tracking app available for iOS and Android. Now you can record your dreams by speaking into your phone or typing them into the app. Keep your dreams organized, search the built-in symbol dictionary, and have AI illustrate and now interpret your dreams, all within the app. You can help support Speaking of Jung simply by downloading the app and creating a free account today by clicking on the link in the description box below or on our website, speakingofjung.com, where you will find links to everything discussed in this episode in the show notes. This video interview is being recorded on Wednesday, December 20th, 2023, through the magic of StreamYard. Hi, Dr. Cambray.
Hello, Laura. Good to be here with you.
Thank you. It's great to finally meet you. It's actually been a long time in coming because I've had on as a guest a lot of people who you know quite well, and they all mention you. So you've been on my list for quite some time. We've got George, Beverly, Harold, Roderick, Linda, Paul next month, and Gus. I'm coming for you, Gus, who I will have on hopefully in the near future. Dr. Gus Zwick interviewed you for the Journal of Analytical Psychology back in 2021. It was published in the November 2022 issue. It's really long, it's 15 pages. And in it, you say some things to him that are very interesting and I'd like you to talk about, but I should let you say hi first. Hi.
Well, hello. Yes, I'm aware of your show and have seen many of the episodes and seen friends on there, and am really impressed with the fine work that you've been doing, and
Thank
really
you.
reaching out to a larger audience through this kind of medium. It's really valuable. So thank you for your service in that way.
Oh, thank you. So if you can get a little closer to your microphone or
Okay.
something, because I was having a little bit of a hard time hearing you.
All right. Let's see. I'll try to
That's
make sure
better.
that's
Yeah,
better.
that's
Okay.
better.
Oh,
And
okay.
then we'll start back up.
Okay.
So I don't even know where to start with you, Dr. Cambray. Your body of work is enormous. And of course, I was made aware of your book titled Synchronicity based on your Fay lectures, but
Sure.
I'm going to step out of the way and let you tell us just a little bit about your background because you studied physics and chemistry and you didn't just
Yeah.
dabble in it. You
No, I
graduated with a
got a
PhD from
doctorate.
Berkeley. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean I grew up um, during the age of Sputnik, and so um, the scientist as hero was very much in the culture of the time, and captured a lot of my imaginations as a child. And so I pursued that, and fortunately, I had some some natural tendencies and natural skills in the area, and enjoyed really learning about a scientific perspective on the world. It it carried me through not only high school but undergraduate and then on to graduate school, where I became more and more interested in the fundamental workings of nature,
Mm,
that's still something that I can see as a through line. But um, as I worked in on my doctoral work, I actually worked in three areas. I worked in an area of chemical kinetics, doing experimental work. I did some work on transuranium elements, and I did the primary thing I did was what were types of quantum mechanical calculations applied to small organometallic systems.
mm,
There's something called methyl lithium and so forth. And what I began to teach me about were fields. I think this is really the origin of my interest in interactive fields, because the electrodynamic fields in molecules, the way in which the electrons distribute themselves among the nuclei. When we did the calculations, it showed some anomalies that weren't expected. The things that
mm,
were supposed to be more polarized and ionized actually had electron density in the field between. And you can hear the metaphors that become
mm,
resonant with thinking about an analytic process and the way in which the dynamics of the interactive field happens between the people as a co-construction rather than as simply uh, analyst and patient as just two separate individuals. Jung actually spoke about this back in the 30s. He was responding to James Kirsch's request for some supervision about some transference streams, and he said, "Yes, those are transference streams, but at the deepest level, we dream not out of ourself or the other, but what lies between."
mm,
It's a very powerful statement. In the
mhm,
1930s, it's already a profoundly intersubjective relational kind of model that's evolving. I've read that at a conference or two, at an intersubjective conference, and got some surprise when I gave the date for the remark, because it was seen as a much later development in a lot of
mhm.
the psychoanalytic world. And it isn't that Jung completely unpacked that by any means. I mean, that's been some of our work, but it shows that there's these kind of resonances between psychology and these kinds of scientific studies.
Yeah. I heard you say, because you and I have never met, we've never spoken,
That's
and
right.
that's not the case with a lot of my guests. With a lot of them, I've either met them, attended their lectures, or spoken with them at length,
Yes,
and this is our first meeting.
indeed.
So I have all of these notes because I've been reading your work, your articles, your books, and watching. There are a lot of your talks available on YouTube, and I will link to all of them in the show
Oh,
notes
great.
for this
Thank you.
episode. Yeah, there's some really the talk you gave at the Aranos conference last year
Oh, yes.
is available on their YouTube channel. And then you gave a talk at Pacifica in 2019 that's up there too. But I
Hmm.
heard you say that physics and psychology might be kindred spirits.
Yes,
I love
yes.
that.
That's Wolfgang Pauli and C.G. Jung when they really formed their partnership. That book, Beverly Zabriskie, was involved with the Atom and Archetype.
Mhm.
Really is a wonderful read when you get the correspondence between the two and you see the mutual influence that was going on.
Mhm. Well, when I asked you to do this episode with me, you mentioned a topic that you wanted to talk about because, as I mentioned, a lot of your material you've spoken about, and this is
Yes,
what new material you called it
yes,
the potential noetic qualities of non-ordinary states of consciousness. So,
yeah.
would you explain that to us?
Well, I'll try to unpack it.
Yeah.
The term noetics, as I'm using it there, really comes from William James.
Mhm.
He was talking in the varieties of religious experience. He has a long discussion about these altered states of consciousness that carry a kind of sense of profound knowing with them, but it's often inarticulate.
Mm.
It isn't so. It borders on what I would call the ineffable,
Yeah.
and yet it gives the feeling of deep certainty. And with the re emergence of the psychedelics, especially the notion of the entheogens,
Mhm.
as a number of them are called, the question comes to mind to really do a full mapping of the qualities and kinds of states of consciousness at various different doses, for example, of these, but also in meditation and other non ordinary egoic states of mind, that we really could use a much more profound understanding of our psyches in terms of what is potentially there.
Mm.
And this has been expanded into a kind of ecological model the more I've worked, the way I can see that the mind is not enskulled. It really is part of it's an environmental phenomena that we
Mm.
our engagement with the world, the natural world, the human world, the cultural world, all contribute to the way our minds operate, think, and function. And so the larger questions that come up then are what kinds of knowledge do we get? We are educated into a kind of very rational, objective perspective about the world. And that's very powerful and very useful. But there's an awful lot that it brackets out that we don't have access to. And just by studying things like dreams, you immediately start to see, well, there's other
Mm.
kinds of knowledge and other ways of knowing about the world that can be really beneficial for us and really help us. And so the question is what if we were to really begin a project of understanding those in a much more systemic way to really map this out? That's really what the thought is about.
Mhm. And I mentioned in the introduction that you were teaching in Japan and
Yes,
you were a professor of chemistry,
yes,
and then you started attending a meditation group. You were doing zazen, right?
yes.
And
Uh, mhm,
you started having dreams. They
yes,
were you called them important and relevant.
yes,
And would you tell us a little bit about how that changed the course of your life or how those
sure.
dreams guided you?
Yeah. While I was in Japan, I had been interested in Asian philosophy for a long time.
Okay.
I actually at the time I was interested in going to China as a first uh, destination, but this was before Nixon had opened it up,
Mm,
or just right at the beginning of that, and
mm,
so it really wasn't possible. I traveled a time or two to China, couldn't get very far in, but Japan was a very open society, and I took this position. I was already questioning. I was already starting to have some thoughts about whether I wanted an academic career in the sciences because of the kind of lifestyle that engendered, which was mostly a very, very long days in the lab and very little human contact. And
Mm.
I was beginning by that point, by the time I'd finished postdocing, realizing there was something more that I wanted in my life. And so that's
Mhm.
another aspect of the travels to Japan. But while I
Mhm.
was there, Kyoto was about a 45-minute train ride away, not far at all. And I found a bilingual group because I was still learning a bit of basic Japanese at that time, and began doing a form of Soto Zen, the Zazen, sitting quietly. Um, and very quickly, it became psychoactive. I mean, the most
Mhm.
obvious manifestation were a series of really interesting dreams where I was finding new rooms in the house that I was living in, and they had both a modern quality and an ancient Japanese quality with a kind of hearth in the center of the room with a fire and so forth. And I could see that this was really having a major impact on uh, how I was experiencing myself in the world. I talked to the Zen teachers about it, and they said, "Oh yeah, these things happen, but don't worry about it; it'll go away." And I
Mm.
and I said, "Well, yes, I mean, I can see that that might be an ultimate goal, but I am not ready to just ignore these without some kind of reflection." And they really weren't interested in helping in that process.
Right.
So I went to the library at the university and found Jung. It was mostly in German, unfortunately, but
Mm.
I still had enough German I could make my way
Mm.
through. But I started reading him seriously and realized that it held some major keys. And I thought, I probably need to really pursue this. And by the time I finished um, that fellowship and I returned to the U.S., I decided I was going to um, an attempt to shift in career and focus.
Mhm.
And that I first studied biopsychology and realized it was not that different from doing chemistry. It was,
Ah, right.
and so I thought, well, that's not really satisfying my need. And so then I began to look into pursuing things in depth psychological direction. And I had the good fortune, I was living up in Northern California in a little town near Chico, a
Mm.
little town called Paradise. And at the university there, where I joined the faculty for a while as a chemist, but I developed a friendship with the head of the religious studies department who had just come back from Zurich, a man named Charlie Winquist. And he and I began a close friendship, which led into my transitioning to going to Dallas and to entering the Jungian world.
So was he training in Zurich?
No, he was a
Okay.
scholar who was interested. He was the president of the American Academy of Religious Studies,
Ah,
the
okay.
AARS, and he had a strong philosophical interest. Actually, he was always trying to convince me to go into philosophy.
Mm.
You don't need to be an analyst; you become a professional philosopher. And I thought,
Uh-huh.
well, that's right for you, but it's not right for me.
Yeah. No, I'm always interested in how analysts discovered Jung, and it's usually a book, right? Because
Yeah,
where else are you gonna find out about Jung, especially back
yeah,
before the internet? Or somebody who another analyst actually, right? Somebody
yeah.
who trained. So I always like to hear that story. And I am also curious. I want to make sure to ask you this. Your Fay lectures on synchronicity and then that book,
Yes.
that was huge. So how did you choose that topic to
Yeah.
or did
Mhm.
you do that work and then they asked you to do a lecture series on synchronicity, or how did that work?
The Fay lecture people were really quite generous and open about
Mhm.
me choosing a topic.
Okay.
Excuse me. What had happened is this was in the lead up to this. I had been working as a newly um, christened analyst, and I was dealing a lot with trauma, a lot of early developmental trauma in my clinical practice, and I started to have a number of synchronistic experiences around that. One in particular that I've used, I would say it's my you know beetle jewelry story, the one that Jung
Yes.
produces. The one for me was the case in which a severely traumatized client and I were working, and I was going to be away for about 10 days. And in the past, I had had to hospitalize this person
Mhm.
uh, at her own insistence as well, because things became very disorganized when the analytic frame wasn't there. And so, after a considerable period of work, she asked if we could have a phone call while I was away,
Mm.
because she felt that if that could serve as a bridge to help her from having to go in the hospital.
Mm.
And so it took some work to really think that through, because formally it's a disruption of the frame, but in talking with some trauma experts about this, they felt that it's the kind of request that needs to be taken seriously, and that it had a potential healing effect. So I agreed to it. And what happened is I called at the set time, and as soon as it rang once and she was on the line and said, "Are you in Germany?" And it's nowhere near. I was in the Caribbean. And I said, "No, but can you tell me why?" And she said, "I had a dream last night. You were in the Black Forest and I couldn't find you." Sort of rushed. And I realized, oh, there's a kind of sense of really feeling lost and without support and help. And so what I did was marshal the resources I could for her and help take her through a kind of reorientation towards what was happening in her life at the moment. And that really helped settle things. In fact, it was successful enough that she never needed to be hospitalized again. That was the
Mm.
end of that um, period. What was the surprise was the next day, I was in my second day of learning to go scuba diving.
Mhm.
And the dive master was very kindly and said, you got the basic stuff here. Why don't you come out this afternoon on a dive? So I agreed, and this is my first open water dive. So we're about 45 minutes from the dock. We're out on the open water, and he called all the divers around and said, "Let me tell you about today's dive site. It's called the Black Forest."
Mm.
And so I thought, oh well, that's an interesting coincidence. And it took a little bit of thought and reflection about, am I in danger here? Am I going to get lost? Was that a precognitive dream that I should attend to, that the patient
Mm.
had? I mean, I ultimately felt that I had enough trust in the dive master, and he was going to be my dive buddy for that particular dream, or for that particular dive.
Mhm.
And it was, of course, almost a life-changing event, because black the Black Forest meant black coral. This was on a coral reef at 30 to 60 feet below the surface, and it was just exquisite. It was
Mhm.
really extraordinary. All the color, the natural life down there. And so when I came back on board, I really sat down and thought, what's just happened here? There's a Black Forest, and both myself and the client are in a Black Forest, but we're experiencing it from very different vertices. And how do we understand now? And that took me into a very long study of Jung's essay, and really trying to take it apart and see what he was trying to get at with this. There was a lot of material that, of course, wasn't available at that time, like the Red Book and so forth.
Mm. Yeah.
But from his published works, I could begin to see what his arguments were, where their strengths and weaknesses were. And it fortunately was at that moment in time when the Santa Fe Institute was really beginning to produce a lot of work. And this is the work on complexity, complex adaptive systems, emergence. And that kind of science made a lot of sense to me, holistic systems. And I could see how you could take synchronistic experiences and see them as a kind of a subset of complex adaptive system reactions, as a kind of an emergent form. And so that really led me on the path that got me to that, uh, to deliver the Fay lectures in the form that they're in.
Mhm. So, for the listeners who may not be familiar, that
Right.
example you just gave us is an example of a synchronicity.
Yeah.
And when I first started this podcast, I was I I was just so frustrated with all of the information I was seeing out there about synchronicity, how that term was being misused, and I was trying to get a handle on it. And it's not an easy thing to understand, and different guests have had different definitions. And that example you just gave, I heard you tell that story, and I neglected to mention this earlier. I've mentioned this on the podcast many times. The roundtable discussions you were involved in with Beverly Zabriskie for the Helix Center back in 2014. There are two of them, and they are phenomenal. There's a whole roundtable of you guys.
I remember.
And I will provide links in the show notes to those videos. But when I heard you tell that story that you just told, it took my breath away. I gasped. I was so moved by it, and I was so startled by that. And so I would like for you to tell us how that, my mind is racing, how that is a synchronicity, and some other things. I'll say this, there are a lot of people out there talking about synchronicity who have no idea what they're talking about. And that's why I read that really long bio of yours. So I'd like for you to tell us how that is a synchronicity and why that is a synchronicity. And also, I just want to mention, I experienced a lot of synchronicities when I was preparing for this episode. And just 2 months ago, I was in Santa Fe, and I drove by the Santa Fe Institute, and I thought, I wonder what they're doing now. I wonder what's going on in there. And then in preparing for this episode, I've heard you mention it.
Yeah. There's actually a Jungian analyst, Jacqueline West, who's married to one of the researchers there at the
So what's his name?
Jeffrey West. Yeah, and he published a recent book called, I think it's called Scale. He's very knowledgeable about this whole area. Excuse me.
I wonder if maybe he'll talk to us about that.
You can ask.
So would you tell us how that's a synchronicity, and use that as an example, maybe to sort of define it for the listeners?
Well, defining synchronicity is really complex. And I'm not sure that it's the best framing. I think part of the confusion that people feel is the idea of synchronous, that is happening at the same time. And it isn't, as my example shows, it isn't always synchronous in this normal sense of time. There was something active in the field that both of us were engaged in. And the coincidence was, of course, the Black Forest. That was the object of coincidence, that and the shock that how could her dream have put me into a place that I didn't even know about? I hadn't even heard of it at the time that we had that. And so the meaning, of course, was multi-layered in terms of not only did it cause me to really reflect on my relationship with that client in a new way, in a deeper way. I saw levels of connectivity in the transference countertransference field that I hadn't seen before at the level of the coincidence. But it's also, remember, my first dive in open water. So it's like an immersion into another aspect of the unconscious. If you took the story and read it as a dream, you'd see that there's a kind of symbolic dimension to that.
Yeah.
And that wasn't lost on the unconscious of the patient, because I never revealed during the course of our work what had happened. And there were good reasons I didn't do that, and good clinical reasons. But nevertheless, the unconscious field was such that she picked this up about 6 months, 3 to 6 months after that experience. She had a series of dreams in the midst of our work where she found herself in the water in the dream, sort of floundering and coming near to drowning. And I would show up and do what's called buddy breathing. That is, you take your regulator, you take a breath, and if your partner is in difficulty, you hand them the regulator, let them breathe, and you go back and forth. And that way there you can get to the surface and get to safety. And her unconscious clearly understood what had been happening. And so there was a kind of intuitive seeing around the corners here, rather extraordinary in terms of this person's case, which again pointed out the way that the psyche was seeing the two of us, we were in something together. And I think that's very much a part of the synchronistic experience. It is a field. It is a field in which something is emergent. That is, it's a holistic aspect of the field in which the people or the person and the object are both active uh, ingredients to the construction of the overall experience. And that's where a complex system becomes, there's sort of multiple components and they interact and they have the capacity to spontaneously self-organize and create an emergent form. And so our dream work and the kind of emotional anxieties that were there were part of what was in the field, and what emerged was the image of the Black Forest, and that was the synchronistic um, core of the experience. And you can find this when you go start looking at synchronicities. Um, they bear these kinds of resemblance to this holistic emergent form. That's the thing that seems to be a common denominator across all of them. Um, and I think that you can make a very good argument that there are synchronicities at multiple different levels of scale. In other words, I think you could look at the intensity of synchronicities versus their frequency and see a correlation. This is what the Richter scale is, for earthquakes, the intensity of the earthquakes and the frequency. So you don't have very many 9.5s on the Richter,
Right.
but you have lots and lots of small ones.
Mm.
This is what's called, you develop what's called in mathematics a power law. Um, I won't go through the physics and math of this, but the idea is that there's a correlation. And I think the emotional intensity can be mapped to the frequency of these things. So we have a lot of, I think, we're not well trained because our education system doesn't alert us to this. But I think there are a lot of these kind of low level synchronistic phenomena that happen in our daily life. You think of somebody, and then what do you know? The phone rings, and there they are. Is a more common kind of thing. And some people even argue, and C.A. Meyer said this to Jung, and Jung was really struggling with this. He thought the mind-body relationship might have a synchronistic dimension to it.
Hmm.
And
Hmm.
if that's accurate, and it may be that the mind is emergent out of the body in the environment, which I think is if you look at theory of mind in contemporary philosophy, this is um, not unheard of. In fact, it's one of the more effective models. And
So, mhm.
go ahead.
So you say that it is emergent.
Yeah.
And when I hear people talk about synchronicity, they think that it's magical and
Hmm.
that it needs to be paid attention to because there's a message in it. I tended to think of synchronicity as this is the way the world works, that psyche and matter are not separate. One is a reflection of the other. That's my thing. So
Yes.
so I lost my train of thought just now, but I want to go back to a word
Sure.
you used, which was interconnected.
Yes.
And I also am going to circle back to that interview you did with Dr. Zwick.
I know.
And in it, you said to him, the archetypal patterns behind culture may be shifting. I think we're moving to a post-heroic age. This is an age where we're attending to the networks, to the interconnectedness between
Yeah.
everybody. Would you say a little bit more about that? It was
Yeah.
fascinating.
There are multiple ways to look at that. I'll pick up a couple of threads and see which ones are most useful. I mean, part of that is coming out of synchronicity, seeing that there are connections that are there that have been invisible, that,
Okay.
like with the patient. And I think you're absolutely correct. It's a cosmological argument. I've spent a lot of time in the last few years rereading the Red Book and so forth, and looking at the imagery, and it's filled with cosmic egg pictures. And
Mm-hmm.
one of the things that I most recently, there's a new book that Leslie Sawine's putting out about times of uncertainty, and I wrote an article there about
Yes.
individuation in the 21st century. And what I'm getting at is I looked at Jung's own emotional development throughout the Red Book, and what struck me on a more recent reading was why did he not stop after his Liverpool dream? This is the dream in which he sees the golden flower on the island, and he wakes up in a state of almost euphoria, and claiming that this he had a realization of the self through this image, that this symbolic mandala-like image really gave him that. And if that's the goal of individuation, you might say, well, okay, isn't that a stopping place?
Yeah.
But he doesn't. And he doesn't really begin the end. The beginning of the end, he makes very clear, is when he's working on this mandala himself, and he receives the secret of the golden flower from Richard Wilhelm, who's in China. He's in Qingdao, China, where I just was actually
Uh-huh.
a week or two ago. And Jung is stunned by that because there's a frontispiece along with the manuscript. It's a picture of the Vajra mandala, and he held it up against his the mandala. He was right exactly at that point in the middle of it, and found a number of really powerful parallels. And this really moved him in a very deep way. And in fact, a couple of months later, in November of 1928, he first uses the term that leads to synchronicity in a seminar,
Mhm.
private seminar, and he's asked about all of these coincidences happening in the class, and he says, "Well, in the West we think of cause and effect, but in the East they look at what's happening at the same time, things that are sort of a horizontal move." And it's very clear that this is coming out of his experience of that. And so he's had this dream of a golden flower. Now he's had the realization with what was clearly a synchronistic experience for him,
Yeah.
the receipt of that at just that moment. And that's his exit. He says this is what took him to alchemy. And so, yes, it did take him to alchemy, not Chinese alchemy, because he wasn't that familiar with it, but he saw the resonance between alchemy and the psychological processes he was undergoing. Now, what it caused him to do then was to open up a whole new field for himself in the study of alchemy. At the same time, I think it also solved his chief dilemma in entering the Red Book. That is when he had those visions, he felt he could be doing a schizophrenia, as he
Yeah.
said. And and then in August of 1914, World War One breaks out, and it looks like prophecy. And he's not really very happy with either one of those. Am
Mhm.
I going crazy? Am I a prophet? What's happening?
Yeah.
Synchronicity becomes a pathway out. It becomes a third.
Mm.
It's something about the fundamental nature of reality. And then as he writes the
Yeah.
essay, he says something that I have always been startled by. He says, well, in moments of synchronicity, it's as if space and time collapse. They go to essentially zero, and the laws of physics are no longer in abeyance. Well, he's writing this in the late 40s. This is
Yeah.
exactly when the Big Bang Theory is being articulated. He
Mm.
couldn't be clearer in a way than saying, I'm arguing for another element in our cosmogony that hasn't been there before. The
Mm.
idea of what I would call pattern formation at the origins of the universe. So, synchronicity, if it's put in at that level, as the early pattern formation before the laws of physics even emerge, then it is profoundly universal and it's profoundly part of the interconnected world. That's one line of thought, and then the other line of thought is the since since the 2000s, the beginning of this century, our understanding of ecology through the use of complex systems has really expanded exponentially. And in particular, the work on understanding, say, the underground networks that hold forests together. In particular, I'm thinking of the work of Suzanne Simard. She's a forest botanist in British Columbia, and she's just done some extraordinary work. She's got an autoethnographic book out there called "Finding the Mother Tree." A couple of years ago, she published this, which is her history of her development as a scientist, but also linked very closely with the understanding of forests. She's the person, even before, more than Peter Wohlleben, who's done the basic research to show how interconnected the forests are through the what are called mycorrhizal networks. These are the fungi that put their roots into the tree roots, and they serve as a kind of communication system. And the extent of that is mind-boggling when you really look at these things. I mean, I can go into details, but you get the picture, I think.
Yeah, and another synchronicity for me, or maybe it isn't synchronicity. I'm open to, is this synchronicity or is this not? But
Very hard to tell.
yeah, so there's a television series that aired in the 1990s called Northern Exposure.
Oh,
And
yes.
I think it was written by some Jungians. And actually, they bring up Jung a lot. And the DJ, he reads from the collected works and various other books by Jung.
Yeah, yeah.
But there is an episode in season 6, and we started watching it from the beginning again because now it is
Mm.
finally available to stream online. It's available from Amazon Prime Video, and it wasn't before.
Mm.
And there is an episode, excuse me, in season 6 called The Giant Mushroom. And I don't want to give it away, but the main
Right.
character, Joel, is having a conversation with Maggie, who is kind of upset that he left. This is the main character of the show. He leaves, and this is the final season. And he tells her, I never left you. I have chills. We're all connected. Like he talks about
Yeah.
the honey mushroom that is,
Yes.
I have it somewhere here in my notes, the honey mushroom that is,
Mm.
I don't know, maybe you know what I'm talking about here, about
Yes.
how it takes up acres and acres and acres, and it's really one organism
Yeah,
with
that's
these
what these
teeny
are.
tiny mushrooms that pop up.
Yeah, the fungi. Yes.
Yeah. So, and then I heard you talk about that in some of your lectures,
Yeah.
mention that. So here it is, the giant mushroom. The honey mushrooms are outcroppings of the same fungus. They run underground for a minimum of 35 square miles, and it's the largest living organism in the world.
Yes, exactly. Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, that's the stuff we're talking about.
Yeah.
Yeah, and the author of that show's mother was a Jungian analyst. I knew her.
Oh, really?
Yeah. Yeah.
Okay. Well, you have to tell me about that off air.
Okay.
Okay. Another thing that you mentioned to Dr. Zwick in his interview of you, you mentioned reconsidering individuation, and you brought that up earlier. You say
Yes.
that reconsidering individuation is another area I hope to explore more. The more we contextualize the psyche in an ecological framework,
Yeah.
the
Yeah.
question of what constitutes individuation is going to change. We are embedded in the world, and our changes inextricably bring us up against everything else.
Yes. Yeah. No, I would stand by that statement. Yeah, the original individuation model is more of a kind of hero's journey, that Joseph Campbell articulated and Jung endorsed in a lot of ways. But again, this is why I went back and reread the Red Book very carefully along
Mm,
this, because I think his actual experience, he didn't articulate this. So we just have the raw data from what he produced in the Red Book. He doesn't say in his models of individuation. He makes some indications that the ultimate part of the hero's journey is the return to the community and the world.
right.
And you've got things like the ox herding pictures that are implied there, and of course Murray Stein wrote a book basically around those, where the hero at the end is coming, the Zen hero is coming back to town, and everything's blossoming
Mm.
around him, or her, and it's this later part of things where the hero's story of fighting the dragon and achieving individuality um, is a very important psychological development. But I think we're getting to a place where that myth itself, which was part of our scientific myth, our hero genius, the Isaac Newtons, the Einsteins, these were kind of our cultural heroes that we were putting out that are part of that myth. We've reached a place where it's to our detriment not to see all of the connectedness underneath. If you even take a field like the history of science and look at the biographies since about 1990, we're finding more and more discussion of all of the relational field that these people were in, who they were connected to, how these
Mm.
networks worked. And so the idea that of the single genius producing these wonderful things is a kind of skewed vision. It doesn't mean that those people didn't have a brilliance and didn't produce really remarkable things, but the contextual world was really very much a part of it. And I think as we move further and further into the 21st century, this level of interconnectedness is really showing up. I mean,
Hmm.
there's research from the Chan Center at Harvard around COVID. And I know it's still controversial in many ways, but I think the model that they've been evolving there is really worth considering. Their argument is that COVID's an opportunistic infection due to global warming. And the way the argument works is as you heat the planet up, animals, especially in the tropics, because the conditions become unbearable for them. So they migrate away from the heat and it moves them up into different latitudes where they now come into contact with migrating birds, bats, and the like, who they've never been in contact with
Hmm.
before. And of course, from a viral perspective, that's the opportunity that's sought to jump from one species to another on these new encounters because immune systems are not prepared for that. And
Hmm.
so viruses can really flourish under those conditions. Then these birds migrate back up and they're caught, and taken to wet markets and so forth. And then, boom, we've got ourselves a pandemic. But the model is that we're driving it, and if that's accurate,
Hmm.
it suggests that if we don't hear the feedback, if we don't get the receive the message from the planet, we're going to probably produce more of this. That we're in a feedback loop. It isn't the planet
Hmm.
taking revenge on humans. I don't think it's that reductive, but I do think we're also setting the conditions for this. And um, there's another level of consciousness we need to evolve. I think this is one of the altered states of consciousness we need that we pick back up from some of the indigenous peoples where they had more of a sense, they had a less sharply focused consciousness, more diffuse, but it was much more able to engage the environment, the ecological dimensions. At Pacifica, we in 2017 we had this huge fire, the Thomas fires, that was followed a month later by these terrible rains and the flooding. Wiped out 101 for several months.
Hmm.
And I was really stunned at how our campuses were not particularly injured, even though some of our neighbors suffered damage. And then I talked to some of the Chumash elders that we have involved with Pacifica, and they said, these were sacred lands for the original peoples.
Hmm.
And I began to then realize there was an ecological eye that could see the look at the arroyos, see the flow patterns and so forth,
Ah.
and that these were sacred because they had this protected quality about them. There was a
Hmm.
deep knowledge and a wisdom that was there, and I think we need to reincorporate that. That's why I'm interested in what I call reenchantment. That's the enchanted world of the past. We've now had a scientific world that's led us to disenchantment, and I think we need to survive. We're going to have to find a pathway towards reenchantment, not going back and just ignoring the science we have, but beginning to get into a larger worldview that really allows the world to be more animate, to really have a way that the ecology of the world and our psyches are in communication.
Yes, and I did do an episode with Professor Maine, Roderick Maine,
Oh, right.
about his new book on
Yes,
reenchantment. Yes, and I saw that you wrote a book review that was
that's
recently
correct.
published in the Journal of Analytical Psychology, and I'll provide a link to that in the show notes. So, would you just, as we're coming toward the end of the episode, but we still have time,
Okay, sure.
what would you say we are steps that we can take to re-enchant our world?
Yeah, that's you couldn't ask me a more pertinent question. That's what I've been working on. I'm in
Mm.
the midst of trying to write a book on the topic, and I've been doing more of this in my workshops. So the first step that took me on that way was to rekindle a sense of wonder,
Mm.
and that's what because we've lost that,
Yeah.
and then from wonder, it's another step towards awe, and that's getting some, press. Dr. Keltner at UC Berkeley just published a book on awe. It's a sort of a popular book, and it's coming back in. And Casement, who you've had on several times, has been working on the sublime, which is the experience of awe and beauty with a bit of terror that's in there. It's like these late 18th, early 19th century paintings you can see where people are in the Alps and there's magnificent views, and yet you sense that there's precipitous drops at
Right.
every turn, and that you feel the sense of awe and wonder in that. And recultivating those as a part of our daily experience seems to me an important thing. And then the next step that I'd like to take in that direction is how to really begin a kind of an active imagination, or more in the language I would use, reveries with nature.
Mm.
You know, I've come to understand in working with traumatized people that the reverie that might be activated in the analyst has much more meaning than has been traditionally been given credit for.
Hmm.
And so how to use that in a disciplined way. And as I've done that over the years, I've now started to say, but what about reveries with nature?
Yeah.
What about when we are out walking in nature? What if we begin to let our minds open to whatever images are in the field? What do we pick up? And how do we begin to do that in a disciplined way? I think that may provide some guidance for the pathways towards reenchantment. So
Mm.
that's an area of active interest and research for me right now.
Mm. It's interesting you mentioned that because I live here in Chicago, and it's December, so it's kind of
Cold.
gloomy and cold, yes. And yesterday afternoon, because the sun sets here before 4:30 now, I looked out the window and I looked toward the west, and I've lived here for almost 20 years. I have never seen the sky magenta, hot pink, and lavender.
Yeah,
And I was, yeah, I mean, awe and wonder and nature and all of those things. And
yeah,
it made me realize how I don't feel those things a lot anymore.
that's right.
Um, you know, so I want to
Yeah,
talk about your upcoming trip to Ireland, which
right.
they do this every year, right? In the spring,
Yes,
this Jung in
yes.
Ireland seminar.
Yeah.
And I was so taken by I went to their website and I saw the titles of your talks. And the first one listed is Divination and Oracles. When the self speaks, do we listen?
Yeah.
I love it, and I would like to hear more. And would you just give us a brief synopsis of that?
Sure. This is something that came to my attention in about 2018-19. Peter Struck, he's a classicist, published a book, Divination and Human Nature. And it was a very cogent and intelligent book. And then I subsequently found that he's spoken at a number of Jung Institutes.
Oh,
Um,
okay.
and he talks about a surplus of knowledge about the way oracles speak, that there are multiple levels of meaning, very much along a symbolic line. And this led me into exploring what was happening in the field. And it turns out there are a whole group of classicists who are re-examining the oracular traditions in the West, particularly like the Pythia at Delphi, the priestess of Apollo, who would enter into an altered state of consciousness and then give pronouncements. And I think the thing that was really most stunning about that was the socio-political implications. This is particularly the work of a man named Stefan Maul, Maul. He's German, but he's been translated at least in part into English. And what he's been looking at is how these women who were in the sort of second half of life, for sure, they'd finished having children and so forth. They were older. They weren't particularly educated in a classical sense. They didn't have a formal education,
Mhm.
but they could enter these states. They had a real capacity for this and to speak out of them, and that the implications were that they stabilized the politics of the Mediterranean basin for about 2,000 years, from
Mm.
1400 BCE to about 400 AD or
Wow.
CE. And they're really asking the question, what's going on here?
Right.
That this group of women who, without any formal authority, they're authorized by the God that they speak they allowed to speak through them. But they have an enormous effect on the entire region and do something that creates the kind of conditions for prosperity and growth. And this is an unacknowledged, unrecognized source. And I thought, that probably says something about oracular traditions more generally, that we need to understand what those states of mind are and what can be conveyed through those, with the kind of perceptual depths that are there. What are people picking up? So it's been a kind of exploration of that. And of course, I spent a lot of time in China. So I, in fact, was just at a conference on the I Ching. We were looking
Oh,
at
okay.
hexagram 61, and it was about heartfelt influence. And it was the image of the lake on the top of the mountain and the relationship between them. And
Mm.
I found it really powerful to uh, look at that alternative divination system and the kinds of world views that begin to emerge out of a deep dive into that. And so, how to maybe do some cross comparison across cultures and see, and perhaps link it with the growth of the interest in entheogens now in the West. And what are we doing? What might be their deeper purpose? Are they
Mm.
beginning to help us see into our relationship with nature and relationship with the world in a way to help bring that re-enchanted feeling back?
For the listeners, would you tell us what an entheogen is?
Yeah, it's not my term, of course. It is one of the alternative ways of describing psychedelics from an experiential perspective. That is, it's a God creating. It creates the feeling of contact with the numinous. And Theo being the Greek for God, gen being like generating. So it's an experience of generating a godlike feeling, not becoming godlike, but
Right.
experiencing an encounter with.
I would like to ask you, as a Jungian analyst, what your thoughts are on using a substance, a medicine, a drug to achieve a certain state of consciousness. And as a meditator, I was a meditator. I did practice TM for many years. But
Yeah,
so I these
sure,
are these are complicated
very
issues.
complicated.
Yes, and there are opinions all ways, but I'm interested in yours and what you think.
Well, this was absolutely central to the conference we just held at Pacifica. After the formal conference ended, everybody stayed, and we broke into groups deliberately to talk about whether we should think about protocols for use. And universally, we decided it's too soon. We just
Okay.
don't know enough about this.
Yeah.
We don't know enough about the dosing. There are many different agents, they have different effects. There was a lot of very knowledgeable people present, and
Yeah.
some who were very skilled at the use of them. But I didn't feel like these were things. One of the things we really did discuss is what is its relationship between the use of these kind of things and guiding those kind of experiences and the analytic process.
Yeah.
And for me, I see them as different areas, and there are several different possibilities. You could learn to be trained in both of them, but then you have some interesting questions about frame issues, about how you move from one to the other, or do you work? Probably my own predilection is to work more as a team.
Mhm.
That I'm very happy to work with a group of people who have expertise in different areas and work in a coordinated way so that someone who's really expert at say guiding may be able to do that. But I think it's still the Wild West. We're still at very
Yeah.
early days, and I can't just endorse going out and doing that as a kind of pathway. I think the dangers of spiritual bypass and so forth are very relevant to those kind of problems. So um, I would say it's too soon to try to make any kind of decision, but let's do more research. Let's really begin to explore this more before we start trying to advise ourselves or others about what we should do with this.
The thing that concerns me about having to take
Yeah,
anything, I mean,
sure.
even the caffeine that I'm drinking, is that it wears off. It's not a
Yeah,
permanent fix. It's not a permanent change. It wears
right.
off and then you need more. And that's my
Yeah,
concern about taking, injecting, swallowing anything.
right. Yeah, it's a question of the robustness of the experience. You know, my wife Linda Carter gave a paper at this on ketamine use
Yeah.
in conjunction with analysis, and it was very clear in the kind of results that they've gotten. And it's not just theirs; there are a number of other people at MGH, Harvard Medical, who are looking at these kind of things. And it really, you need the combination of, if you're going to use that kind of medicine, to do psychotherapy so that you can get something more resilient. You're left in a state that may be more open to possibilities, but if that isn't seized and worked on, then
Yeah.
you're right. It just becomes a cycling over and over and over,
Yeah.
and there may be deleterious effects for long-term use that is counterindicated.
Right.
I'd be very cautious about that.
And side effects too.
Yes, absolutely. Well, look at the Matthew Perry story, sadly.
Yeah. Yeah.
I mean, I know it's complicated, but nevertheless, ketamine
Right.
is pretty significantly involved in that.
Right.
I mean, I'm
Um,
also interested, for example, because I've done so much work in China,
yeah.
how you translate this kind of psychology and its methodologies and everything else um, across cultures, because the same stories are not inherent in the culture.
Right.
I did a course for some Chinese on the black book to the red book, the kind of, and the more I looked at it, the more I realized, well, you need to understand, for example, biblical history fairly well to follow. He doesn't give you footnotes that tell you this is a reference to this story or that story. And if you're coming from a culture where that isn't inherently built in, it can be rather mystifying as to what's going on and why is he talking about that. So the questions for me then are this is the structure of the psyche identical across different cultures,
Mm.
different languages? I don't think so. It's not that we can't all recognize our humanity,
Mhm.
but there was some wonderful experiments that were done, in the late 90s, early 2000s, I believe. I think John Hopkins and Rutgers were involved. They did some ethicists got together with some neuroscientists, and what they did was they put people in fMRI machines to see what gets lit up, and they asked them ethical questions.
Mm.
Give you a dilemma where you've got to make a choice, and
Yeah.
it's messy, and there's an ethical correct answer, but it's not easy or simple. And what they did is they put people in from multiple different cultures, and
Mm.
what was fascinating was the answers that they ultimately came up with were fairly uniform. That is, uh, humans are fundamentally ethical. They try to solve these things to reach what they feel is an ethical answer, but the pathways in the brain were quite different.
We're quite
The way,
different?
yeah, the way
Yeah.
in different areas of the brain lit up were not the same across cultures. And so, therefore, the way in which we solve problems, the way in which we conceive the world, is not identical. And what are the psychological implications? What does it mean to do psychotherapy then, if that's the case? For example, I'll give you a real quick example. I had
Yeah.
a client from a European country that I didn't speak the language. And the person came to me because they wanted Jungian analysis and to talk about dreams. But I was having a terrible time entering their dreams. And finally, it dawned on me after a while. I said,
Ah.
"What language do you dream in?" They told me, "Oh, of course, my native tongue." And I said, "Tell me the language. Tell me the dream first, but you don't speak that." I said, "I just want to hear it." And sure enough, there's what was
Mm.
missing. I could not hear the music of the dream because I was getting a cognitive translation. And it was only
Interesting.
when I heard the person tell me, and then I could feel the affect.
Yeah.
And it's that I said, now I need both pieces. You need to tell me
Interesting.
in your language, and then give me your translation, and I can work with that then.
I think we're so afraid to talk about our differences.
You know,
It's we're being so careful. It's not politically correct, but we are different, and that's okay.
sure it
And
is,
then that
no
brings
doubt.
into What if there are intelligent species in the universe that are visiting or will be visiting, or some
Right,
say are already here? How are we
right.
going to relate? We can't even relate to differences here on this planet.
That's right.
Let's keep trying. Let's keep learning about that. Let's keep talking about that.
Yeah, how do we learn languages? Think about those forests that you're talking about. There's a real intelligence in those forests.
Mm.
When you look at what they're capable of doing, it's pretty awesome. And you start to think about that, and it's like there's an anthropologist in Latin America, Eduardo Kohn, who wrote a book called How Forests Think.
How
It's
forests
really
think.
yeah, yeah, it's really interesting because it brings us into these questions about and here again, I would say indigenous peoples around the world, first peoples, have tended to have more of a consciousness that evolved and developed in nature in that way, and they have much more of a sensibility about how to listen to and how to be in dialogue with that. I mean, some of it looks a little bit like active imagination. The plant speaks to them often in a personified form, but beyond that, beyond the
Mhm.
kind of sort of Western imagination constructions, I think there are other ways of sensing and being in the world with these other organisms of the planet that can be communicative. And how
Mm.
might we foster better pathways for communication and understanding? Those are the
Wonderful.
altered states.
Yeah. Well, thank you so much for joining us today. We really
Sure.
appreciate it. And there will be links to everything that I can find on you on the internet in the show notes for this episode. And if I don't know if you had any parting words for us before I wrap up.
No, just thank you for what you're doing. I think having a chance to get some of these ideas out and talk with people it's for me more about beginning dialogues. It's
Mm,
really entering into conversations. It's I find myself still seeking and looking and the more I feel I can connect with others and listen to them. I'm interested when I go to different parts of the country in the US and just listen to audiences. They have different experiences around
yeah.
these realms.
Mhm,
How important it is to gather up that collective voice.
mm. Well, thank you so much for the work you do. We really
Okay,
appreciate your time
thanks,
today.
Laura. Okay, now,
Please visit the website speakingofjung.com for more information on everything discussed in this episode and to access all of our previous episodes available to stream or to download for free. Speaking of Jung is also available on YouTube podcasts, which you can access by subscribing to our channel, Jungian Laura. It's free. Just click the subscribe button below. This podcast is made possible by the revolutionary new dream tracking app, Temenos Dream. Discover the hidden meaning of your dreams using symbolism, literature, and mythology. Use the built in AI illustrator and dream interpreter, and share your dreams with others, all within the app. Download it by clicking on the link on the episode page or in the description box below, and set up a free account today. I created Speaking of Jung over 8 years ago as a free podcast. All of our content is still free to access, but it is not free to produce. Please visit the support page on our website at speakingofjung.com/support to learn more about the myriad ways you can now help keep this podcast going. So, with special thanks to Gus Swick, George Hoganson, Roderick Main, and Beverly Zabriskie, I am Laura London, and you've been watching a very special video edition of Speaking of Jung.